to Kill a Celebrity. A hot wind swept up from the Mississippi as Annie Watkins entered Channel 5 through the employee entrance. Barely a year out of school, she hadn't expected to hear back from Nola's favorite news at all, let alone in the same week as her interview. The job hunt had been arduous, but with any luck it was finally over. Annie thought, and not for the first time, about destiny. After a wait of a few minutes, a man named Ray Smart met her in the foyer, introducing himself as her supervisor. She laughed aloud, elated by the news, before rushing to apologize for the outburst. After so long working at the City Park Muffuletta stand while looking for a job in her field, she could finally tell them she was done unless, of course, she screwed it up acting crazy on her first day. Ray gave her a tour of the station. She'd been to several TV facilities the past year, almost literally begging for unpaid work, but had never gotten the full tour. When Holly Weathers, a fitting name for a meteorologist or an adult film star, strode past them in the hall, beaming her sunny smile on them, Annie found herself a little starstruck, but she managed to conceal it well. Ray was friendly in a businesslike way, chatty about colleagues and staff, but never offering gossip. Annie, with a pad and pen, took notes of things he seemed to feel the need to stress. Rotating shifts, days and afternoons, with overtime as required. Annie came back on Monday to meet the man who'd be training her. Scrawny, hunched over, wearing prescription sunglasses, a Rush 2112 t-shirt and cargo shorts with gray tube socks pulled up to his virtually hairless shins, the man reminded her of a grimy 80s record producer. His brown hair was thick and wild, skin like tallowed leather and teeth so clean and straight they could only be dentures. "I'm Bert Ellis," he said, offering a scrawny hand with 2 long fingernails. Annie took it, zapping him with static. She pulled back, shaking out her hand in pain and embarrassment. "Sorry," she told Bert, who stared, mouth agape, in something like horror. "Must be the carpet." Bert's dentures clacked shut, and he gave her a measured look. "Must 'a been," he agreed. He didn't appear to be pleased to have her beside him in the cramped editing suite, but he did as Ray asked, showing her the ropes in a mechanical, droning way as they recut a digitized version of the Rod Serling obituary Bert had edited on 2-inch quadruplex videotape in 1975. Annie was too young to remember The Twilight Zone, but she recognized the theme song. She found Bert's tobacco smell unpleasant, and his stolen half-smiling glances were vaguely disconcerting, but she learned a fair bit, and made copious notes. During lunch, the two of them sat side by side in the cafeteria, eating without conversation. After lunch, more of the same, a methodical recitation of information and demonstration, after which Annie showed him what she'd learned. "Close enough for cable," Bert said at 5 minutes to 6, pushing out of his chair. "That's enough for today. Hasta mañana. I need a fucking drink." The following day, Annie returned to work to discover Bert Ellis had retired. "You're on your own," Ray told her. But I'm not ready. Bert told me you have a gift." He said, what was it he said? Was it, practice makes perfect? "You'll do fine. It's just standbys." The telephone rang. Ray gave it a look of annoyance. "Let's touch base at the end of the week, huh?" "Wait a minute, sir, what are?" The door closed behind him. "Standbys," she finished with a resigned sigh. "Standbys," Kyra Ng told her over lunch. "Obituaries of famous people. Say the Queen dies, or, I dunno, Steven Tyler. You need an edited package for a live hit. You've seen them. The more famous the celebrity, the more unstable, the older or sicker they are, we've got their life stories on hand, ready to tweak the second the news of their deaths comes down the wire." The cafeteria was noisy, every seat packed with techies, office workers, and on-air talent. The sports team took up the table next to them, chatting and guffawing in the phony-sounding way they did during color commentary. Annie found it difficult to hear. "That's pretty morbid, don't you think?" she asked, leaning in close, taking the opportunity to spear a crouton from her colleague's Caesar salad. Kyra raised her eyebrows by way of reaction while she chewed and swallowed. "Morbid?" She sipped from her water bottle. "Welcome to 24-hour news." Annie and Kyra, who worked in the edit suite across the narrow hall, had made fast friends. A little older, a little more cynical, a few too many animal sweaters in her wardrobe, Kyra edited hard news pieces: terrorism, murders, arson, gang violence. As for Bert, he had edited the standbys for as long as Kyra could remember, and she'd been at Channel 5 for 12 years. Word was he had started in the telecine days, when they shot programs on film and transferred them to tape for air. "It was weird that he retired like that," she said. "He musta had his foot halfway out the door, just waiting for you to get here." Annie nodded. "Maybe." She recalled his strange sidelong glances. At the time she thought he'd been ogling her, but now she had to wonder. "Anyway, you'll do fine. That's what Mr. Smart said." Kyra laughed. "Mr. Smart?" She shook her head. "It's Ray, hon, just Ray." After lunch, Annie sat in Bert's old editing suite considering it as her own would jinx it, she felt, and waited for an assignment. The whole day long, no one had entered the room after Ray had left her with Bert. She hadn't thought anything of it then, but after hours of twiddling her thumbs in front of the identical wavy backgrounds on the two computer monitors, she started to wonder if she'd entered the twilight zone herself. Peering across the hall, she waited until Kyra looked up from her work and caught her eye. "What's wrong? Should I be doing something? It feels like I should be doing something." From down the hall, a deep male voice Annie recognized as one of the Live at 5 news anchors shouted, "Kyra, how's that ISIS piece coming?" Kyra threw an annoyed look at the wall. "Keep your pants on, Phil." She turned back to Annie, looking frazzled. "When they need you, they'll let you know. But what do I do until then?" Kyra provided a brief look of sympathy. "You've got the internet, don't you?" Annie faced the Mac's desktop, found the browser icon. "Uh-huh. Well, there's a whole World Wide Web there just waiting to be discovered," Kyra told her, and swiveled her chair back toward her desk. Annie stared at the icon a moment, then clicked it. The browser opened. She watched the cursor blink in the search bar. She hadn't signed on for this. She craved action. She wanted hard deadlines, she wanted Phil McCready yelling at her for the ISIS piece. Sitting all day facing 2 monitors each with empty edit windows, they were paying her for this? At 6 p.m., after what seemed like endless hours surfing the internet, Annie grabbed her purse and stood up from the desk. "Close enough for cable," she muttered to herself, and stepped into the hall. "See you tomorrow, Kyra." Kyra looked up, still frazzled despite having handed off her piece. "You bet." Annie made a weak attempt at a smile. "Have a good night." Kyra saluted her, and returned to the screens. It was a week before Annie's first original standby obituary. The second day on her own, a young blonde production assistant with hipster glasses and a wallet chain told her to update a few older standbys: a hip-hop artist with a notoriously dangerous lifestyle, an actor with a degenerative disease, a famously inflammatory politician facing a handful of death threats. Then, nothing. Several days, staring at the monitors. On the 4th day, she brought in some home videos to practice cutting. Her father having passed 2 years prior, she thought she'd put together a little tribute to him for her parents' anniversary this year. Not sure if such a thing would be appropriate, she'd asked for her aunt's blessing before proceeding. It was difficult for her to watch, at first. Eventually, she grew accustomed to seeing her father's face again, the way his bright smile rose all the way to his eyes, the way he often swept a hand across the top of his head, as if brushing away non-existent dandruff from his close-cropped hair, how he'd sweep Annie and her mother up in giant hugs and twirl them from the kitchen, passing under the creaky banister, to the front room. Orville Watkins had been a defense attorney before taking up the gavel, though his closest friends had been calling him Judge since grade school. He'd been a good father, had called Annie from the office when putting in extra hours, and when he finally attained the chair he'd been born to fill, he'd spent long evenings in the backyard, tooling in the garden while the sun sank over the lake. She'd bring out a tall glass of bitter iced tea, the way he liked it, and he would beam his big smile up at her. All the while, all those years, an invisible noose had dangled over his head, poised for the right moment to tighten. At noon, with a good amount of footage digitized and some clips dragged in a rough edit on the timeline, Annie broke for lunch. How did Bert deal with so much boredom? She wondered, slinking off alone to the cafeteria. With Kyra on days off, she had no one to sit with. Other people in her department were pleasant enough but seemed to be too busy or too into their own cliques to offer much more than a nod and smile. This seat taken? Startled, Annie looked up to see the creepy old camera operator from Live at 5, though she'd already identified him by the aura of cheap scotch. He stuffed an apple in his mouth like a cooked pig as he sat, setting his cafeteria tray down on the table. She thought his name was Walt or Wilt, though it didn't matter. She wasn't so desperate for company as to consider making conversation with a career alcoholic. Bert asked how you're doing, he said, crunching the apple between words. She wasn't sure if he was talking to her or the news anchor across from them, but the newscaster, a term Annie always liked, as if they created the news through magic, dressed in a pinstriped suit, didn't look up from the sports pages. Excuse me? Bert Ellis, Walt. It was Walt, she remembered, Walt Brenner said. The guy whose shoes you filled? Oh. Some people thought Bert had come into money, but it didn't look to Annie like the guy had ever seen real money in his life. He'd retired early, apparently. No golden handshake, just a reduced pension. And no one knew why. Never did occur to you why they let you jump the book to get that position, did it? Jump the book? Whole ass load of union members looking for editing gigs, he said by way of explaining, not to mention freeloaders, I mean freelancers, excuse me, and they give the job to you, fresh out of college. He crunched his apple, breathing loudly through his nose. You couldn't give that job away, sugar. Then here you come, fresh-faced and innocent, ready to take on the whole goddamn world. He swallowed just as noisily as he breathed. Bert knew right away, you were the one. Annie sipped her vegetable cocktail, playing nonchalant. What does that mean, the one? He would have felt a whole lot better if it had gone to someone who deserved it, you know? Really deserved it. Like that little twerp who does cheerin'. I'd love to smack that kid in the chops. Walt gnawed off a chunk of apple, looking off while he chewed, likely imagining how the scene would play out. I don't want you to blame Bert in this, okay? He didn't choose you any more than he was chosen. Just bad luck, I guess. Some of that Nolan's juju. But he asked me to tell you, the burden is yours now. And practice makes perfect. He set the apple core down, already beginning to go brown. I'm real sorry this had to happen to you, kiddo. That's me saying that part, not him. The last bite of chocolate croissant stuck in her throat and wouldn't go down. She took a big gulp of juice, swallowing hard to dislodge it. Sorry for what? She tried not to gasp for breath. There's nothing to be sorry about. I love my job. Walt Brenner gave her a look, his tired gray eyes jittery. Suit yourself. He shrugged up his skinny shoulders and slid his tray away from her, moving himself to the next seat. A half-hour later Annie returned from the tape library with an armload of yellow Betacam boxes. Not sure what she was hunting for, Annie came across a movie she hadn't seen since she was a kid, which started her on a hunt for more of Eddie Bing's comedies, talk show appearances, and stand-up specials. She made herself stop at the 7 tapes she could carry without mishap, hoping to find more footage in the digital archives. Kyra stopped what she was doing to give Annie a funny look. "Anyone come by while I was gone?" "Just some tumbleweed." Kyra smirked. "Looks like you got your work cut out for you." Annie shuffled the tapes awkwardly. "Yup. That'll be the time someone gives me an assignment, right? Don't count on it." She stacked the boxes beside the old VTR, and, one by one, began racking through the tapes, looking for the best clips to digitize. With headphones on. Her laughter at Bing's antics drew the attention of Kyra. "You all right in there? Remember that movie Cool Feet?" Kyra sneered. "Ugh. I hate Eddie Bing. So corny." Annie shrugged. "I like it." She caught Bing hamming it up as he tried to remove his foot from a toilet, and laughed a little quieter, self-conscious. Kyra shook her head, while Bing ended up slipping out of his shoe and fishing it out of the toilet, only to be caught by his fiancée's father with the dripping loafer in his hand. Annie cut the footage together into what felt like a fitting tribute, a good mix of Bing's comedy performances and dramatic roles, with sound-ups in all the right places, ending on a slow-mo clip of his famously awkward smile. And fade to black. Something jingled down the hall toward the edit suites. Shuffling feet on the carpet stopped at her doorway. The PA's wallet chain jingled once more, then quieted as she stopped in the doorway. "We need a new standby, ASAP." Annie rose in her chair, brightening. It took her a moment to realize a more respectful expression was required. This was, after all, someone's life. "Who is it?" The P.A. Hillary, Annie recalled from her first day notes, caught a look at the monitors and staggered back a step. "God," she gave Annie a look of horror. "How did you?" Annie followed her wide-eyed gaze. "What? It isn't. It's Eddie Bing." Hillary shook her head in incredulity. Behind her Kyra peered out of her suite with concern. "Suicide, they think. Dead in a hotel room, that's all I know." She tore her eyes off the screens to look at Annie again. "How did you know?" Annie felt accused. "Me? I didn't know. It's just a coincidence." The PA took another step out of the room, shaking her head. "Just. I'll get a reporter, for the voiceover." She backed away until the doorway was empty. Her jingle shuffle disappeared back down the hall. Kyra remained in the door to her own suite, eyeing her queerly. "Annie? You okay?" "Yeah." Annie was shaken by the coincidence. At least she hoped that was all it was. She felt like she'd stepped on a live wire plugged directly into the macabre machinery of the universe. "Yeah," she said. "Just a little weirded out, that's all." "No doubt." Kyra was clearly a little freaked herself. "Let's get a drink tonight, huh? Just you and me." Annie nodded, turning back to Bing in the dual monitors. Looking at it now, she recognized how haunted it appeared. Unlike her father's, the smile never reached Bing's eyes. "I think that would be good." They sat at the bar, drinking 2 sweet Sazeracs, watching KBNO's sister 24-hour news channel. Annie's ponytail had come undone, sticking out from the purple elastic like frayed wires. Beside her perspiring old-fashioned glass, she'd ground a small pile of peanuts into the scuffed, dark wood. She plucked another nut from the bowl, cracked it open, and smashed its insides under her glass. Eddie Bing's death occurred 2 weeks before the theater premiere of his latest comedy special. A dramatic series had just been greenlit with him in the lead role. He'd been reuniting with his ex-wife, and communicating with his estranged children again. All signs pointed toward a renaissance in Bing's career, in his life, until suicide. Kyra shook her head at the big screen TV over the bar. No one could have predicted that. Just a whole lot of bad luck, Annie. It happened at the same time. A troubled look crossed Kyra's face before settling on a sympathetic smile. Coincidence. Hung himself, just like. Annie simply shook her head and crushed another peanut. The anchor repeated that more would be revealed about Eddie Bing as it was discovered, then through to the 11 p.m. news. Annie's standby was the first piece. Turn this up, Kyra told the muscular bartender. When the segment ended, she turned to Annie, their faces washed in blue light from the TVs. No matter how you feel about it, that's a hell of a package you cut. Annie said nothing, merely sipped her drink. Hey, it took me 8 years to make the top story, Kyra told her. You did it in 6 days. Are you trying to make me feel better, or worse? Kyra shrugged. Little of both, maybe. I'm totally jelly. Annie allowed herself a grin. Her companion nudged her with an elbow. There's that smile. She turned toward the bartender's gleaming bald head. Bartender. When he turned, she shook her glass. Another 2 Sazeracs, poor favor. It really is good, isn't it? Annie asked when her companion's attention wandered back from the bartender's tight jeans. Too good, Kyra agreed with narrowed eyes. I better watch out. You might make a standby of me, and take my job. Annie slugged her in the shoulder. Kyra cackled, rubbing her arm. I'm totally kidding. It's not funny. Dead serious, Annie scowled until Kyra could no longer keep a straight face, and the two of them busted out laughing. The bartender gave them a peculiar look, only making them laugh harder. Annie came in hungover the next morning, the licorice taste of absinthe still on her tongue. She stood in the doorway to her edit suite. It was hers now, no denying it, and peered in at the equipment. Green lights flickered in the dim room, lighted by the overheads in the hall. Nothing particularly menacing about anything. And yet, a groan from behind shook her from the edge of psychic distress. Krya shambled toward her, baggy eyes and hair a mess. I am so tired. Me too. Kyra stepped past her into the dim room and flopped down in Annie's chair. Annie imagined latches clamping down on Kyra's wrists, the chair swooping her toward the desk, the twin monitors turning themselves on like the eyes of a malevolent animal rousing from sleep. But the monitors remained dark. Kyra looked up at her in mild curiosity. "Whatcha doin'?" she asked, drawing out the words in sing-song. Annie shook her head, temples throbbing. "Nothing." She following Annie's gaze toward the monitors. "Annie, it was a coincidence. It's just a bunch of," she plucked the mouse off the table, set it back down. "Harmless junk." She flicked on the monitors, one after another. They brightened to their wavy backgrounds and tiny icons, not malicious eyes, not a cackling malevolent demon trapped behind the twin screens. Annie nodded. Of course it was a coincidence. Of course. She hummed the Twilight Zone theme. Kyra squeezed her aching temples while the two of them laughed. A metallic jingle moved toward them. They both turned with identical looks of dulled shock. "Annie, we need a standby for Eleanor Harrison," Hillary said, not daring to meet Annie's eyes. "You guys look like shit." "What happened?" This was Kyra. Annie couldn't speak. "You guys didn't hear? She's on the news right now." Kyra changed the input on the small monitor beside the VTR. Without sound, all they saw was a black man in his mid to late 50s speaking somberly from behind a podium. Behind him was Eleanor herself, 53, a tad overweight but otherwise healthy, hugging her grown children, who in turn hugged her grandkids. The story swept along the bottom of the screen. Pastor and civil rights leader Eleanor Harrison cancer diagnosis shocks family and friends, celebrities lend support. Shocked into action, Annie got to work, scouring old library tapes for clips of Harrison in sermons, interviews and debates, protesting another black youth gunned down by white police officers, shaking hands with Maya Angelou and Queen Elizabeth. Watching the highlights of this uncompromising woman's life, Annie couldn't help but feel genuine sorrow. Harrison was one of her parents' heroes and her own. She cut a suitable tribute for the woman, sweetened it with somber music, and had Phil McCready sit for a voiceover, all the while bothered by the look on Hillary the PA's face when Annie handed the Bing standby to her. After work, she puttered around the apartment for hours, trying to get the Harrison standby off her mind. Couldn't happen twice, she told herself, a mantra on repeat. Inevitably, she ended up opening one of a stack of photo albums. A photo of her parents made her smile, young and in love in the 80s, Orville with his short Jerry curl, her mother's blonde hair in Bo Derek cornrows that dangled over her dashiki dress. Exhausted, Annie finally fell asleep on the sofa with the book in her hands, missing the 11 p.m. news by 11 minutes. She woke early the next morning, but still had to rush to get to work on time. Driving in dense traffic with the news on and a cool breeze coming from the open windows, the words "Eleanor Harrison was found dead" shocked her so badly she stepped on the brakes in the middle of the road. Horns bleated by on either side, vehicles swerving to avoid collision. Annie sat rigid behind the wheel, breathing shallowly, unable to think beyond those terrible words "found dead," let alone make the movements required to signal and pull off onto the soft shoulder of the road. She couldn't go back to work. Couldn't face that room, those monitors. Fear got her moving again. She pulled into the Raising Cane's lot, told the on-call scheduler she was ill and wouldn't be able to make it in for her shift the next day, then speed-dialed Kyra's cell. "Hey, sweetie." There was compassion Kyra's in her voice. Still at work, she'd obviously heard the news. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Annie said. "You wouldn't happen to know Bert Ellis's home address, would you? That old creepazoid?" "Oh yeah, me and him were tight." "Kyra, I'm serious." A moment's silence. "There's a master list in scheduling. Let me go see if he's still on it. Call me back." "I will," Kyra said, responding to the urgency in Annie's voice. "Are you coming in today?" Annie told her she wasn't. Probably a good idea. People are really creeped out about that standby, especially after Bing's. Although I think most of them are just jealous you made top story twice in 2 days. Annie sat in the car, peering out at the red and white blur of passing traffic. Twice could still be a coincidence, she told herself. Couldn't happen again. Her ringtone startled her. Got it. Kyra rhymed off Bert's address. "Be careful, Annie. He's one odd duck. I'm not entirely sure he's not a serial killer. I'm not entirely sure I'm not one," Annie thought. She offered thanks instead of voicing her concern. Bert Ellis lived in a boathouse in the West End. The next morning, Annie parked beside his truck in the small lot up the road, gold metallic paint with a cap on the bed and a bumper sticker declaring editors do it non-linearly. Bert's twiggy mail order and/or stripper girlfriend answered the door in a kimono. She shouted into the dim house in a thick Eastern European accent as if the couple lived in a multi-story house rather than what was essentially a double-wide trailer on the water, then lit a cigarette and slinked away inside, but not before shooting Annie a scathing look. Bert came to the door in a grimy robe he was still tying over boxer shorts and scrawny, hairless legs, blinking rapidly before putting on his prescription sunglasses. "Well, I can't say I'm surprised to see you, except for maybe that it took you so long to show up." Dishes clanged in the sink inside, deliberately loud. Bert peered toward the kitchenette. Annie couldn't see from where she stood, but she could imagine his girlfriend or wife doing the dishes in a fit of jealousy. "Guess we should probably take this outside. Let me get some pants on." A few minutes later they sat down at a picnic bench in Breakwater Park, overlooking Lake Pontchartrain. The dark scudding clouds from earlier had moved off toward the east without rain. In hurricane season, the city would surely have felt their wrath. Nearby, children shouted and scurried while their mothers gabbed. "You're scared, aren't you?" He stuck an unlit smoke between his lips with a sheepish grin. "Why did you leave so suddenly? I take it you're not ready to talk about this." Annie held her tongue while Bert lit his smoke. "It was the 70s when I started at Channel 5, Bert told her, back before all that 5 means live bullshit, when we still called it KBNO. We were still smoking in the studios, and everybody, I mean everybody, was on coke." He dragged on his smoke. "That's what I passed it off as, at first, some paranoid dope fantasy." Annie didn't ask what he meant. There seemed to be no point in pretending she wasn't scared out of her wits. "The Sorling standby, the one we worked on last week? That's the one that really got under my skin. The first handful, it was easy enough to pass them off as coincidence. With Sorlings, I couldn't shake that feeling like standing on a live wire," Annie said. Bert agreed with a solemn nod, blowing smoke as he squinted out at the clear, flat water. "How are you sleeping? Any nightmares?" "I don't sleep well." "No, I wouldn't imagine. That'll change. You'll get used to it." "I don't want to get used to it." Annie watched a little girl in a polka-dot dress chase 2 boys around the swing set. "I keep thinking it can't be real, it couldn't be me causing this to happen. Except for that feeling." Bert butted out his cigarette on the picnic table. "I used to think the film caused it. When Sorling died, KBNO still had a lot of old footage on film. We had to transfer to video with a process called telecine before we could cut it for air. They probably taught you about it in school." "They did? Good. I thought maybe it was the silver gelatin, you know. Silver's been thought to have magical properties for centuries. Personally, I think it's a bunch of bullshit, but back then I was grasping at straws. And hell, this was Rod Sorling we're talking about. The guy practically invented shit like this. June 26th I cut that obituary. Sorling was my 3rd standby. We knew he had heart troubles. By then he was already in the hospital. Docs were talking about open heart surgery. These days that's nothing, but in those days, it was a huge risk. It took him 2 days to die from that last heart attack on the operating table, but I knew. I knew, that last one was because of me. But you must have done hundreds of obituaries since then. Every one of them died? Only the completed standbys seem to do it. Think of it like casting a spell. It ain't gonna work without reading the last few words, will it? But you did it again?" Bert raised his t-shirt meatloaf's bat out of hell to reveal a long white scar from his right hip to the middle rib on his left side. "Ouch. You said it. I flew the coop after Sorling died." He mimed a plane taking off with his right hand, an unlit cigarette poised between his fingers. "I wanted to get as far away from the Big Easy as possible, but I knew I couldn't stand those New England winters. Miami seemed like a good start. Took the airlift flight from New Orleans International. This was long before they changed the name on a rickety old DC-8. Annie didn't know where to begin. She couldn't imagine why he would have come back, burdened with the curse she now bore herself, and told him so. He grinned. Guess you never heard about Airlift International Flight 208. Annie admitted she hadn't, but she was starting to feel as though she knew what happened. I swore to myself I wouldn't do another standby. Not a single one. I mean, I quit without a day's notice, just up and left. Packed a bag, hightailed it. I got on that plane feeling, blessed relief. About as close to whatever you want to call a religious experience as I'd ever felt. I mean, I was 20 years old. I didn't know shit about God. But when that plane took off, I felt like I could join the seminary and be perfectly content for the rest of my life. He lit the cigarette. Took a long drag, long enough for the ash to curl. Weren't up in the air 10 minutes before the trouble started. There was this loud boom, and suddenly the plane is leaning on its side. Not just women and children screaming, but grown men. Hell, I was screaming. Those of us who hadn't fell into the lap of their neighbor or into the aisle were hanging from our seatbelts. They told us later that an engine blew. But I knew different. He narrowed his eyes at her. It was pulling me back. It wouldn't let me leave until I was done. Annie merely shook her head. I prayed like I never have in my life. I promised I'd go right back to work if whoever was in charge of all this would spare my life. I meant it, too. And just about the time I'd finished promising, the pilot managed to get that bastard horizontal again by some force of sheer luck, and we water-landed in the Gulf just past Chandler Sound. If we'd been any closer to shore, no doubt the gators would have been eating leftovers for weeks. Out of 127 passengers, 53 of us made it, including 2 stewardesses, without whom we all would have drowned. Everyone in the cockpit died. Everyone in the front of the plane died. Miserable, groveling excuse for a sack of shit. Me made it out alive to kill again. And God help me if I didn't think that someone like me had already cut the story for the late news. That someone had, through the same sort of magic or what have you that made me cut the sorrowing obituary, caused that DC-8 to drop out of the sky. That's... Annie didn't know how to describe what he'd told her, so she merely said, "Wow." Bert uttered a morose chuckle. "Honey, that is the understatement of the goddamn century. And you know, there isn't a day goes by I don't wish I'd died in that crash. That it ended, whatever the hell it is, with me on that plane in 1975. Cut to 40 years later, Annie said sardonically. More like a long cross dissolve. All told I've killed 38 people. I wish like hell I'd had the guts to kill myself. Annie's father might have amened to that. Of course, having sent an innocent man to the chair in 1990, and having later discovered the deceased's innocence through DNA evidence linking the murder rapes to a man already doing time for aggravated assault, Judge Orville Watkins had hung himself from the banister in the Watkins family home. Executioner was her family legacy. Why me, Bert? Why did it have to be me? It's a dirty job, but someone's gotta do it. He favored her with a dour smile, crushing another smelly butt on the table. I wish I knew. I'm sorry, but I didn't choose you any more than I was chosen. That's what Walt said. I think there's more to it than that. Bert shifted uncomfortably, wiping away bits of cut grass that had blown up onto the table. It wasn't a choice, you gotta understand that. You ever see someone for the first time and swear you've met before? It's like that. First time I saw you, day you brought in your resume, I passed you in the foyer and knew you were the one. I gave my notice that same day. Then when we shook hands. The spark. Passing on the torch. Old Jewish fella by the name of Ham Gottlieb ended up blowing his brains out with an antique Ruger after passing on the hex or whatever it is to me. I mean, this guy survived the Holocaust, and he couldn't hold another week with what he'd done. You think it's a curse? Annie, I wish I knew. This is powerful shit you're dealing with. I mean, this thing survived film, videotape, all the way into the digital age. Who knows, it could have existed before film. Maybe the guy who passed it on to Gottlieb wrote obits for the Times-Picayune. All I know for sure is you don't just quit on it. I learned that the hard way. He slipped the end of a cigarette out of the pack. Not another one, Annie said. Please. Bert shrugged, tapping the butt back inside. She thanked him. Her lungs thanked him. I still don't get how you knew they'd pick me. They could have picked anybody for the job. Same way I knew my time was up, and for the same reason old Ham Gottlieb picked me out of every kid who put in an application, I suppose. He traced out the symbol for infinity with a finger on the table. After a moment, he looked up at Annie again. Way I figure, they don't know they're doing it. Probably think the decision was theirs, when they hired you. When they hired me. But it's not. They're just playing into the hands of fate. Annie shook her head. So there's nothing I can do. I just have to what? Wait 30 years for that feeling to hit me? Pass it on to the next poor kid who drops off her resume? I honestly don't know. Bert smoothed his mustache. I feel for you, kid, sincerely, I do. But, and this might sound insensitive, but have you considered keeping the balance? Like what? Yoga? Fucking meditation? Bert snickered. Hell no. I mean, you make a standby for someone who might actually deserve it. Maybe get some serial killer's death penalty put on the fast track. He shrugged. Make some scumbag scam artist like Madoff get his just desserts. She thought of her father's gray face. The noose. The creak of the banister. Annie had been the first one home that night. If Lydia Watkins hadn't stopped for groceries on the way from work, she might have spared her daughter a lifetime of questions, of nightmares. I couldn't do that, she said, her voice weak. Play God like that. Aren't you already? I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but it seems to me like God's been on extended sick leave, don't it, sugar? Don't call me that. All you old-timers call me sweetie and sugar, and it drives me up the fucking wall. Annie, it is. Bert grinned sarcastically, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Wouldn't want to upset you. You might wind up making a standby for me. That's not fucking funny. And I wouldn't. I can't. I can't do it again. Not ever. Suit yourself, Bert said. Sooner or later fate or destiny or whatever it is makes you and me and Gottlieb do what we've done is gonna force your hand. All I know is, when I hated my job, my life, I did everything I could to make it as painless as possible. He plucked the twisted butts off the table, and pushed himself up with a groan, both from himself and the aging wood. I wish you all the best, Annie Watkins. Sincerely, I do. But if I spend any longer out here shooting the breeze with you, the wife'll be fixin' to bob at my ass. Annie watched him go, shrinking into the distance across the long expanse of grass, the weight of helplessness pressing down on her, stopping her from chasing after him and screaming at him until her throat was raw. The table creaked as she stood herself, creaking like the banister, like the noose around her father's neck. She wondered, and not for the first time, if suicide was her legacy, too. Maxine Watkins kept shop in Bywater, selling Central African-inspired art and sculpture out of her home. Fat little terracotta heads with bug eyes and fish-like mouths were her biggest seller. One even graced the contemporary Louisiana art exhibit at NOMA. As a child, they'd always reminded Annie of the illustration from the books of Roald Dahl. Maxine poured her niece a glass of iced tea, then sat on a small stool at the work table. She did good business with her art, good enough to move into a larger home in Algiers or the Garden District, but she'd lived in the sliver by the river long before her name became known in the local scene. She had her studio, her kiln out back, and a small living quarters in the Camelback upstairs, and that was all she required. Annie sipped her tea. Bitter, the way she liked it. "What's on your mind, child?" Maxine asked, kneading a large hunk of clay. "You didn't come all the way out here to drink my tea." A ghost of a smile crossed Annie's lips. "No, I didn't. But I would, you know. It's that good." Maxine waved the compliment away. "Is this about your job? I never did congratulate you, did I?" "No. Thank you, Auntie Maxie." "Well? Are you going to tell me or would you have me drag it out of you?" Maxine wore her hair in a scarf, and her overlarge, brightly colored shirt couldn't hide the many paint stains and smudges of dried clay. Annie had always admired her aunt's artistic abilities, but she'd never envied her wardrobe. In snug blue jeans and a white t-shirt, Annie felt underdressed. She told Maxine everything. "Well, that's quite the tale," Maxine said, pushing aside another fat little head ready for the kiln. "If you weren't your father's daughter, I wouldn't believe a word of it." "You believe me? I've never known you to lie, even when you should have. You didn't come to tell me a story, though, now did you? You came to see if I could speak to the Loa on your behalf." Maxine was the only family member who practiced what Annie thought of as authentic Louisiana voodoo. Annie's father had disavowed it, ashamed of the commercialization and skeptical of the religious aspects, although her grandparents had been traditionalists, like Maxine. Annie had loved Maxie's sculptures and paintings, but the hoodoo charms, the dolls and gris-gris in her aunt's bedroom, had always intrigued her most. She'd often wondered if they were merely decorative, or if Maxie had ever used them. Tears stood in Annie's eyes. "Please," she said. They fell, moistening the clay in 2 spots on the table. "I can't live like this." Maxine took her niece's hands. The dried clay felt chalky against Annie's skin. Maxine held them firmly, glittering green eyes fixed on the deep brown of Annie's. "Though it works through modern tools, this evil is old, Annie. Make no mistake." Annie shivered. Despite the late spring heat, the warmth from her aunt's hands was just about the only place she didn't feel cold. "Can you help me?" Maxine kissed her fingertips. The warmth spread to Annie's wrists. "I can try." The halls of Channel 5 were virtually empty when Annie brought Maxine through. The security guard on duty looked up from whatever he was watching behind the big desk and gave them a nod. Annie used her card on the door, and held it open for her aunt. "He's cute," Maxine said once they were safely behind the door. "For you, I mean." Annie shook her head, proceeding down the main hall. Maxine followed, lugging the cloth bag onto her shoulder, glass clinking inside. A spiral staircase took them down toward the newsroom. As short as the two of them were, they still had to duck under the ceiling. The overheads came on as they entered the carpeted hall leading toward the edit suites, startling them both into an embrace. Maxine clucked her tongue. "Look at us. Scared of the lights." They chuckled nervously and let go of each other. Annie continued to her suite, flicking on the light before entering. Maxine settled her bag on the chair. "I expected something more ominous. This. Is it cursed?" Annie wondered. "We'll find out, won't we?" Auntie Maxie opened up her bag of tricks. She brought out the candles first, white and black, a half dozen of each. To send the evil back from where it came, she'd said while taking them off the shelf and packing them into the bag. Next came the checkered cloth in red and white, which she laid on the chair, setting the fat candles atop it. Red and white. Those are Papa Legba's colors, she explained. Annie repeated the name as a question. You'll see, Annie dear. Maxine began marking out a large circle on the carpet, a cross in the circle. Can't do this without the cosmogram, Maxine explained, reacting to Annie's mortified gasp. She laid the cloth over the center of the cross, placed candles at the ends of each line. She removed 2 tall wine glasses from the bag, a bottle of water, a bottle of white rum, and a clay pot painted red, then placed them on the cloth. She poured water into 1 glass and stood it in one of the pie-shaped areas she'd chalked, and the contents of the rum bottle into the second. Into the bowl, she placed a handful of salt water taffy, a cigar, and a tea candle. She scattered some coins beside it. For the offering, she explained. Maxine poured water into a rag, and held it out to her niece. You might want to cover the smoke detector. Annie did so, wrapping it with the dampened fabric. The 2 of them lit the candles together, then Maxine stood in the circle, holding out a hand to Annie. Annie took it. Stepped into the circle. In the silence, the hall lights went out. They turned to each other, momentarily frightened. Somebody ought to do something about those lights, Maxine said. Annie agreed with a nod. Maxine led Annie in reciting the Lord's Prayer, Hail Mary, and the Apostles' Creed. Once finished, she let go of Annie's hand, got down to her haunches, and raised the bowl. Odiu Legba, she cried, holding out the bowl to the 4 directions. Papa Legba, open the door. Open the door for me, so that I may pass. Annie listened to the dull hum of electricity, watched their flickering shadows on the wall. There was no live wire feeling tonight, senses dulled by too much crying, too much worrying. Open the door, your children await. The monitors flickered on. Annie sucked in a nervous breath. We wish to speak with the Loa. We wish to speak to Baron Cimetière. Video was already playing in on the twin monitors. Watkins Family Home Movies. The 2 women shared an anxious look. That wasn't you, was it? Maxine asked, an edge of fear in her voice. Annie merely shook her head. Something about the videos troubled her. Something was different, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. The hall lights buzzed on. Both women turned, expecting the Baron's dark figure to enter the room. Suddenly it hit her, Orville and Lydia Watkins weren't present in the video. All the time she'd spent cutting it, making it just right, and someone had removed all the clips of her parents, leaving only herself and Aunt Maxine. Boots clomped down the hall toward them. Maxine clasped Annie's hands tightly in her own as a tall figure stepped into the doorway, candlelight flickering over the figure's brute features. She recognized him immediately. Not a supernatural presence, but the night security guard, the one Auntie Maxie called cute. You ladies can't be burning candles in here, he said, eyes wide to take in everything. You can't be doing voodoo in here, neither. Hoodoo, Maxine corrected, before apologizing and hurriedly blowing out the candles. Annie joined her, fear still gnawing at her like animals chewing on electrical cables. The videos had played by themselves, for one. For another, they seemed only to feature herself and her aunt. The security guard stood out in the hall while Annie and her aunt gathered everything back up into the bag. You know, you could get into a lot of trouble bringing alcohol onto the premises, he warned Annie. We'll keep that in mind, Maxine said for her. Have a good night. A light rain had slicked the pavement as they made their way to the car. You felt it in there, didn't you? Maxine asked. An evil presence, reaching out from beyond? I don't know. Those videos, playing by themselves. Did you make those? Annie got in behind the wheel. It was the video for Mom. I thought you said it was a tribute. I didn't see your father in them at all. Didn't see your mother either, come to think of it. Annie started the car, drove out of the empty lot, her mind still on the videos. She pulled out into oncoming traffic without looking, watch out. Annie jerked the wheel, swerving a hair too late to avoid the oncoming car. The sedan clipped the driver's side and Annie's car spun out, skidding over the slick street, leaping over the opposite sidewalk. It struck a tall hydrant head-on. Shattered glass silenced Maxine's rising scream. The airbag exploded in a cloud of talcum, bursting Annie's nose, the pain dulled by the agony in her lower back as the seatbelt jerked her backward. Stars flooded her vision. The horn bleated out into the night. She came around a moment or minutes later. No one had come across the accident yet, so she assumed it was the former. The airbag had deflated. Blood smeared over its silver surface, her own blood. The windshield lay in pieces on the crumpled hood. What she at first took for rain pattered on the roof and fell in through the window frame. Even in her semi-conscious state, she understood the collision had popped the hydrant. With immense strain, she turned toward Maxine. Rain fell into her eyes. Her vision blurred, went pink, as she stared at the empty passenger seat. Blinking away blood, it struck her, Auntie Maxie had gone through the windshield. Please, she thought, as a queasy wave of oblivion washed over her. I'll do whatever you want, just please, don't let us die. The promise echoed in her ears as her world faded to black. Getting back to health took time. She'd suffered fractured discs, had broken 2 ribs and fractured 2 more. The surgeons had straightened her nose, stitched gashes in her forehead and cheeks. After weeks of healing and physiotherapy, Annie once again sat in front of the editing monitors in her 8x10 cell, a sentence she would serve 40 hours a week until her time came to pass the torch. Ray Smart welcomed her back, told her he'd touch base with her at the end of the week. For the constant pain in her back, he'd brought her an orthopedic chair. Maxine had survived the crash with extensive internal injuries. Blood was drained from her skull, her punctured spleen removed. Due to compound fractures in her left leg, she walked with a cane. Walt Brenner, drunk and speeding toward an overtime shift, had passed away in the second ambulance. Annie eased into her new chair, gazed for a moment down at the indistinct chalk marks left on the carpet between her feet. The pain wasn't so bad with her pills. She'd been taking too many, but the haze was navigable. She settled in behind the monitors, and got back to work. On the streetcar ride to work, she'd read about Congressman Lassiter, a staunch homophobe and segregationist currently suffering from heart troubles. When the PA jingled down the hall, dragging her feet on the carpet, Annie was ready. How did you? Hillary began. But of course she knew. They all knew. Just keeping the balance, Annie said with a morose chuckle, handing it over. Kyra peered over from across the hall, and for a moment, their eyes locked. She turned away quickly without expression, and the PA crept out of the room, standby in hand, glancing back at Annie until she was gone.